Have you ever thought, is rhythm linear or cyclical? Is music conceptualized in a straight line or in a repeating cycle? Well, let's answer this question and start by defining what rhythm is. Rhythm is the organization of sounds in time. Essentially, as long as there's some intentional ordering of sounds in time, you've got something musical. But this then begs the question, how are these sounds organized? Well, if we start with a constant steady beat, that's already a form of organization. The next most common step is then to group these steady beats together, most commonly in groups of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. There. Now you've got a repeating cycle of 4 beats. And there we go. Rhythm is cyclical. But wait, why then is most sheet music written in a linear fashion? We read music page by page, like reading a book. Well, to understand this, we need to delve a little into the differences between what are called notation-based and oral music traditions. Talking about notation-based traditions. Music notation is the process of writing music down in a format where transmission of information is feasible. So one example, the most common example, is Western notation. Western notation is probably the most dominant and widespread form of notation. But there are many other forms of notation around the world as well. You have cipher notation in much Indonesian and Chinese music. You have sargam notation in Indian music, and so on. Well, knowing these isn't important to this discussion. When a functional system of notation has been developed to such an extent where it starts to be used as a primary tool for composition, as it has in Western classical music, that's when the music's rhythm starts to take on a linear nature. Remember, rhythm is the organization of sound and time, and now that you can write out the music clearly on a sheet of paper, you have the ability to take liberties in changing the meter. Because by writing out the music in a linear fashion, you can create complex changes in rhythmic grouping or meter at any point in the time, right? So when you write it out on a piece of paper and you change the meter, you can trust that the performer will be able to read the music as one reads a book and will perform the change in meter accordingly. So this is how Western music has evolved into the linear nature that it has today. But now let's talk about some other traditions, the oral-based traditions. So on the other hand, as opposed to Western music or notation-based traditions, many musical cultures around the world do not have as sophisticated a system of notation as Western music. These are called oral traditions, and while they often possess some form of notation, they are less sophisticated and mainly used for documentation and communication purposes rather than as a compositional tool. And as such, these musical cultures adopt more of a cyclical conceptualization of rhythm, where a constant grouping of beats repeats itself over and over as a cycle. So then, the music then weaves itself through this constant cycle, and the concept of cyclical rhythm is conceptualized in a wide different number of names in different musical cultures. Some example would be tala in Indian classical music, kompas in flamenco, and for example, gongan in Indonesian gamelan. But now, does this lack of a sophisticated notation system and therefore the absent possibilities of a linear rhythmic conceptualization make oral traditions inferior? Absolutely not. In fact, in many ways, oral traditions are far more developed than their notation-based counterparts, and this is because music is an oral art form. Its primary medium of communication is sound. And therefore, there are many intricacies and complexities in sound that simply cannot be accurately represented in Western written notation or in any written notation. So where Western classical music prides itself in its highly sophisticated and developed notation system, at the same time, it is limiting itself to the very limitations placed upon it by that notation system, because you have to write out the music. After all, how accurately can words and graphics communicate performing a piece, say, jubilantly or smoothly? How do you write that out? Furthermore, there are some musical concepts that Western notation cannot even try to replicate. One such example is gamakam in Indian classical music, which is the precise movement and oscillation of musical pitches. In oral traditions, these musical intricacies are passed on from generation to generation through the intimate teacher-to-student relationship. Learners immerse themselves in the music of their teachers and absorb the fine details through constant listening and repetition rather than through written music. So now we come to the question, is linear or cyclical better? Well, rhythm can be both linear or cyclical depending on the musical style in question, and it's important in this discussion to not value one as better than the other. So instead of competing against each other, let's acknowledge the differences and benefits between each conceptualization of rhythm, linear and cyclical. Because in appreciating this diversity of rhythmic conceptualization, we are better poised as musicians to better appreciate, understand, and perform these musics. Kita nam tum kiri kiri